A critical current issue in healthcare research today is the glaring gap in research that delves into the health experiences of Black women, specifically from nuanced and holistic positionalities. By not addressing these unique challenges and experiences, we risk perpetuating systematic biases and overlooking crucial insights that could lead to more effective and targeted supportive health approaches. As part of this effort, it's also imperative that we amplify the voices of researchers who can provide a more nuanced and intersectional perspective on Black women's health. This would not only benefit the academic and research communities, but can also have positive real-world impacts on healthcare policy, practices, and outcomes. Welcome to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, the space where research meets the real world. And in today's episode, Dr. Jamita Nicole Barlow discusses her contribution towards addressing this gap in knowledge about Black women's health by discussing her book, Writing Black Girls and Women's Health Science, Implications for Research and Praxis. Today, she shares the ways this book explores the complex interplay between health, history, and research in the construction of knowledge regarding Black women's health. I was so excited when I saw your book coming out, which I think is really powerful and important for everyone to get a chance to read, which is Writing Black Girls and Women's Health Sciences, Implications for Research and Practice. I was wondering if you could maybe tell us what motivated you to write this book.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about not only the book, but my motivations for writing this book. They are deep-seated. I believe it originated in 2000. It was right after the 2016 election. And I was headed to National Women's Studies Association for a meeting, but it was in Canada. And what was very interesting is they wanted to make sure we had return tickets right after that infamous election. And so it was hilarious, but we were all, my colleagues that I ran into, we were all in the spirit of like, what can we do? And one of my dear friends from Spelman College, who's also a faculty member and doing Black Girls Health, we just sat and talked and we were like, we need to do something. And we went to a session at the conference, and Paula Giddings was there. And at the time, she was the editor of Meridians. And when I asked the question in her session, like, what can we do as interdisciplinary scholars when we're trying to really talk to multiple audiences around a very central issue? In this case, we were people rooted and trained in public health, but also had this psychology, poetry, writing, Black studies, all these different fields that we wanted to engage. And she said, oh, you should do a special issue, and invited us to do a special issue right there on the spot. And so we spoke, and I actually had the pleasure of being her last special issue before she left her editorship and before she retired. And what was great about that, it then launched a conference that I did at my past university where we had over 200 researchers, young scholars, esteemed scholars focused on Black girls and women's health coming from different fields. We did the special issue. We had dancers, choreographers, anthropologists, physicians. We had everyone represented. Then we did I did the conference. And then I taught a course at my current university. I developed and taught a course of the same name as the book. And it was through teaching that course twice that I was like, okay, we got to do something here. We've got to make this last. And I was approached at a conference, the American Psychological Association, and someone from the publisher's house said, hey, look, we want you to look at this as an opportunity to write a book. I didn't have it in me. It was during COVID. And it was one of those moments where we had a lot of loss in the family. And I was like, I don't have it in me to write a book, but I know how to draw upon people. And so really, that's where the book came out of, that very long story, but very succinct and clear landscape of how this book came to be. And now it's like, what do we do with it? And so that's what we've been doing, some interesting things with that. So that's how the book came to be, as a way to bring in people who were invested in women's health, even if they weren't a physician or in public health, that let's start that conversation and let's center it around Black women's ways of knowing. And that is the important part.
I think one of the strengths of your book, which I really appreciated, was the interdisciplinary nature and the focus and the diverse topics, which you've just talked about. But you yourself have an interesting background. How did this book fit in or reflects all of that interdisciplinary sort of lens and experience?
I absolutely love that question because I think that's a large part of what the book is. I think how we choose to do the work that we do in research or in praxis or whatever it is that we're doing in this world is really the end result of a lot of different experiences. And for me, I was an English major at Spelman and a writing minor. And it was there where I really learned how to use African American literature, just literature in general. But I really focused on Black women's literature while I was there. But I was able to use literature to really help understand and explain contemporary issues. And I found what I really discovered is like we had the guidebook. Black women gave us the way. And that was really the nugget that helped me kind of understand the world and understand why I do this work in health. And so from there, I went on to graduate school, and along the way, I always knew I wanted to do something in women's health, but being a physician wasn't really the goal. And so what happened is I really started to understand that these skill sets I was developing, whether it's yoga, meditation, being a doula, all of these things were really tools to help address issues around this broader understanding of Black girls and women's health, which has been a lifelong commitment to me. And it was something even before Spelman I had this interest in. I just didn't know how to get there. And so I look at Spelman as being kind of a bridge to that, to how do you get there? How do you do the work? But I also look at that for other people, really understanding how our lived experiences and context not only shape who we are, but really shape our intention, our purpose, and how we move in the world. So our ontologies and epistemologies, which I talk a lot about in the book. And I think for me, it's been really life-changing, things I didn't think I would do. I never thought I would leave a women's studies program and go into a writing program. Yes, I have an undergraduate degree in writing, but it just so happened they needed someone who could teach writing around science and health, and I could create whatever course I wanted. So it turned out to be the best of all my worlds. And so I think sometimes when you are pursuing your true interests, it kind of everything just starts to align and just shows up, these opportunities. And I'm grateful for that. And that's really how I came to be in the space. And along the way, just doing all these other things that I see as tools to eventually addressing this issue.
How did you go about bringing together this community of women to write these chapters? What were the steps and what were some of the challenges you might have faced?
Well, one, I don't know why I did this because I thought I had learned from the special issue. What I learned with the special issue that I did with Dr. LaConte Dill, who's at Michigan State University and does a lot of work around Black girls and poetry. What we learned from that process was we had to do a lot of care with the writers. It was a lot of, oh, I'm not important enough to write this. I am not capable, or just like nobody really cares. And I think as a researcher, as a Black researcher, as a Black woman researcher, and I can't speak for all people of color, but I think there are those imposter syndrome moments that happened. And for us, we saw it show up. People who were well into their career were like, oh my gosh, why are you asking me this? Why do I need to do this? So I thought I had learned my lesson with the special issue Meridians. But again, this book opportunity came up and I was like, okay, let's do this. I think I can do it, but I can't do it alone, just my own book. I was like, let me bring in others. The editor at the time was like, make it your own. I'll work with you. And about a third of the authors in the book were in the special issue as well. And they wrote about something slightly different. So that helped. But the others were people either I knew well in my network or were somehow in my network. So I didn't do a lot of cold calling. But what I did do is try to find people who could write about things in interesting ways. And it is still heavily psychologist, I will say that. But I really tried to pick how psychologists were thinking about Black women's health. And it was really around spiritual, ancestral, emotional, mental, physical, really trying to address all of those domains. And I don't think we do enough of that. And when we look at health. And so the goal was really to tap into people I know who were doing some interesting work that I think when you're talking about philosophies of science and ontologies and epistemologies, the part of science that we don't teach in methodology really anymore. I was trained in it because of the professor that I had in grad school, but a lot of people do not teach ontologies and epistemologies. And so I thought it was necessary that we heard Black women's ways of knowing and doing this work, because we read so many of these philosophers that are white men, and we then apply that to Black women. And it's like, well, Black women can also think about things using narratives and how that can create these theories or contribute to the creation of theory. And that was important for me, and really understanding what are we doing wrong? What are we doing right in this fight to have optimal health for Black women and girls?
What are some of the stories in the book that you personally found really interesting or new for you?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I almost have to bring up the table of contents so I don't forget anybody. I will say one of my favorites was Dr. Jernigan Nwesi, If You Can't Relate to Me, How Can You Treat Me? Centering Black Girls' Voice in Culturally Responsive Health Praxis. What I liked about that is because she really gave some practical, this is what you do. And I think sometimes when people read books, they're like, it's just up in the air, up in the sky. What can we do? So what I liked about that, it was practical advice. Dr. Afia Mbilishaka, she was in a special issue before. And that's one of my favorite pieces in the special issue, where she gives this history of Black women and hair. I remember how my grandmother and my mother were like, you can't just let anyone touch your hair. And there's a spiritual ancestral reason for that. And she breaks that down. So I love that in the book, she was then able to take her autobiography to give some framing to that. And that I think was just beautiful. I love how Dr. Miranda Ward talked about other mothering as community praxis, and really bringing in not only people she kind of looks up to, but how grandmothers or other mothering, or even if you haven't actually birthed, what mothering looks like. That to me, I never would have heard anyone talk about Black women's health from a research perspective, using it in that way. Dr. Flowers talked about sex ed. She works for Planned Parenthood. So to have someone that high level in Planned Parenthood talking about how can we central Black women's ways of knowing. And even Dr. Danielle Dickens, her piece in Shifting and Stress, it's related to y'all's book. It's just amazing. Yeah. I could go on. I don't want to do all of them, of course, but what I loved is that they all offered something different, and it was a delicate balance. I wanted it to be very practical for some, and also knowing the authors, knowing oh, this is how they write. This is going to be a stretch for them, helping them stay in their lane, but also pushing them to stretch a little. So I think it was a delicate balance of the care. One day someone needs to write about the care that's involved with writing and supporting other writers.
You talked a lot about the importance of framing this, you still using research, but challenging the research from a Black woman's positionality. Why was that really important, particularly as a scholar that's navigating academia, which is really not a friendly or supportive environment typically for Black women?
I remember being in grad school, and I have this whole interesting history. It was one of my many grad schools, not the one I finished, but one of my many grad schools. And I remember being there, and we were, how you have to you have those lunches where, you go through and people present a paper and you review it. But then in class, we would also review papers. And I remember reviewing this one paper. I was in a public health program at the time. They were getting really excited that this community ate 3 more vegetables a day. And they thought that was a successful study. And I was just thinking about how this can't be, this is not success. It's interesting, right? What motivates people to eat more fruits and vegetables. But it really sat with me. And this was in my early 20s, and it sat with me. It's one of those things, I think it happens. You have these moments, it sits in your head, and you kind of say, okay, one day you'll probably come back to that idea. And it hit me later on that I'm reading about a lot of white men and why they developed this method, or why they developed this statistic, or why they're doing this. But I didn't see Black women. We'll develop frameworks, right? But they're not talked about or discussed in the same way. And I kind of grew up in a household that if it's not there, you create it. And so I did a little search. I probably didn't do enough searching because some of our stuff often gets discontinued, right? So I do know, I think in the early 1900s, there were some people talking about some of these things, but it's hard to find some of this information. So to my knowledge, there's not like a book that does something like this where it's all Black women. I will say there are 2 white women. They are in my research lab. So there are 2 white women a part of this. My research lab had a chapter. But there wasn't really a central place where people could go and say, I feel seen. What I'm thinking about, I remember being in class thinking, I have family members who are dealing with this. And this is not how they're thinking about it. This is not the way to go. And people telling me, well, this is what the research says we should do and you should think about it this way. I was like, well, this is not the way. So I wanted to offer a space where people had something they could cite and say, this is the way. And there are people doing it and this is how they could do it. So this is one of those books like you sometimes got to write it, because I remember Toni Morrison's quote saying that years ago that if the book you want isn't out there, you got to write it. And I think that's exactly what this was for me. I wish I had this when I was a grad student.
I think that's such an important way of framing it, that when we're thinking about these books, who are they going to help? What is the legacy of this book, long term, but even short term? When you're thinking about that for yourself, who do you want to use this book and how can it be used across different contexts and settings?
I know in the introduction, I kind of mentioned that, but I want it to be for everyone. But I also know that it's not accessible. The reality is that I worked with an academic publisher who chose the price. I had nothing to do with the price. And it's not accessible, even to my family who want to purchase and support. The paperback, when it comes out next year, that will be accessible, but that's a year and a half after the actual book. I want it for researchers, of course, because I am first and foremost, as an academic, I'm a researcher. And I wanted it to be something that people could cite. I've already had grad students who've reached out to me. I've gifted some of the grad students and I've already had them say, this is what I needed to cite. So to me, it's like, this is helpful, it's useful, but I also want it to be something that people could share with them. I had someone from my hometown gifted to his mother. And I understand that his mother, she's like, I don't know all of what it is, but this makes sense and I get it. So I want it to be, that's affirming to me. I want it to be for everyone. I love for it to be one of those books that it's in someone's hair salon and they're like, yeah, they're talking about this. You better go. Like, these women are doing it. And that's why, to me, the cover was important. And what I do know for books for people who aren't academics, especially, you need to have something engaging. And that cover was created by an artist in Tacoma neighborhood of DC. And I fell in love with her artwork, a Black woman. And I loved how she used texture, and that particular piece I fell in love with. And then I asked her if she could be on the cover. I could use it for the cover art. And she said yes. And so that was a major part of making it accessible to everyone. I also have had folks in government reach out to me and they've talked about how it's helping them think about research on women's health differently. And so that's, to me, success, is that I want it to be a book. It doesn't have to be a bestseller, but if it's making you rethink how we do this work, then it's doing the job that I'm seeking to do, is to really transform how we help improve the lived experiences and the health status of Black girls and women. So there are actually 2 quotes that I love to share that I think best represent. They're from the introduction. The first one's on page 3 and 4. And I'll just read them. We subvert notions of whiteness, patriarchy, and capitalism as the gold standard for health behaviors, frameworks, theories, and methodologies when we have epistemologies such as granny midwives, birth workers, community healers, church women, hairstylists, conjurers, herbalists, and naturopaths with ways of knowing that have carried us over generations. Mm-hmm. And what I love about that quote is these are the people who no one would call them a researcher or a scientist. Exactly. These are the people who have been doing the work, and we don't lift them up. We're not allowed to lift them up. And that's the work that we must do. And then the other quote I love, it's on page number 7 and 8. And that particular quote I will read as well. We are not in a deficit of literature describing the status and explaining the health outcomes disproportionately affecting Black girls and women's health. This descriptive and explanatory work is important, foundational, and necessary to the Black women's health canon. Yet this book is not that work. We are not distracted. And so what I mean by that is there's that famous Toni Morrison quote where she says racism can be a distraction. And so this is not a book to say this racism did this, did that. If you notice through the book, we don't focus on that. We focus on not just solutions, but these ways of knowing and doing that actual work, because that is what the distraction is racism. Are we against racism? Yes. Are we against sexism? All of that. But I think those parts are important to highlight because a lot of the work describes and explains, and we're here trying to move that forward.
That was Dr. Jamita Nicole Barlow discussing her book, Writing Black Girls and Women's Health Science, Implications for Research and Praxis. To find out more about Dr. Barlow, including accessing her book's information, her research articles, and social media handles, go to this episode on our website podcast page. That's it for this episode of the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast. Be sure to check out our upcoming episode topics on our website, located at www.psychologyofblackwomanhood.com. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please leave a rating and review on whatever streaming service you use to listen to this episode. And to stay up to date with our upcoming episodes and all of our related activities, you can follow us on Instagram using the username @Psychology of Black Womanhood. Thanks for joining us.